Good afternoon. I am MD and this is the Fourth Branch Project. Since after the 2016 presidential election, the country has never been the same. Of course, well before the 2016, there were always a divide between parties in this country. There were always discussion, debates, division between Democrats and Republicans. The country has always been divided. Usually when we say among party lines, it simply means that Republicans believe in a score of what quote unquote we would call values, and Democrats ditto. But what used to separate those two entities were strong enough to prevent anything substantial from ever happening. That's why the expression gridlock in Washington was one of the most used expressions in politics. And for the past, I'd say 2 to 3 decades, the approval rating of the legislators in Washington has been really pretty low. Sometimes even have to ask the question as to what exactly do they do? What do we taxpayers pay the legislators for? And what makes it even sometimes more ironic is the fact that every election we go to the poll, and most of the time we elect the same individual that we complain about is not doing anything. And I know that's the case because some of those legislators have been in Washington almost forever, since the first time that they were elected, some 20, 30, 40 years. Today, I believe that Mitch McConnell is the longest serving senator or legislator, for that matter, in Washington. Now, what usually makes it very difficult, if it's not impossible, for anything to be done, we, the people, are always inclined to blame the legislators for what's going on in Washington. We sometimes throw the towel. Some of us simply give up the idea of going to the poll because we feel it's a lost case. And the sometimes animosity between the two camps is so palpable that there is really no way whatsoever one can imagine there is going to be some sort of compromise in order to solve the problem, whatever that problem is. Now, just like the rest of the country, there was a time when I used to blame the legislators for what's going on in the country. Now, don't get me wrong, that they do share the responsibility also, but in all fairness, they are not the primary culprit, and the situation either gets worse or never changes, not because of those legislators, but rather because of something else or someone else. Because we are so busy blaming the legislators for the kind of problem that's going on in Washington, what we call gridlock, and we are consumed by the flow of information that comes to us in the form of news, and most of the time we have really no patience first to get the news, to absorb it, to analyze it, or to even make use of it, so that for the next election we can decide what's best to do. Now, that predicament makes it such that election in, election out, we, the people, do the same thing over and over and over. So a major part of the blame, I would say 60, 70, maybe 80% of the problem for the gridlock in Washington falls on the shoulder of we, the people. I know it's very hard, sometimes very difficult, and at times even impossible to accept responsibility or to blame ourselves for a problem. But after I spend as much time probably as everybody else blaming the legislature in Washington, I set out to figure out as to why in the world we, the people, would keep electing the same individual that we complain about, the same people who are not doing the job. And sometimes you can sense the anger in the voices of people who have either the opportunity to express themselves about what's going on in Washington about any particular topic, and yet, even if the election happens a few months down the road, after we express ourselves so vehemently, but we still go to the poll and we elect the very same individuals. Now, that aspect, of course, falls squarely on our shoulders as the people, to not to have taken the step to correct the problem. Now, that doesn't mean the legislators are doing what's right either, but if you have a spoiled child, in the general parlance we call it a brat, who keeps being rewarded for doing the wrong things, what incentive do you think that spoiled child have to do the right thing? So in a sense, that's really what been going on in Washington. We, the people, keep rewarding the legislators, parentheses, spoiled children, for not doing the job for which they were elected. They become brats. And the next election, we, the people, in that case, the parents, decide to give them what they're looking for, what they're asking for, which is to re-elect them without questioning their motive, without questioning whether they're gonna change or not, without even caring that they're gonna do anything differently. So in a sense, we, the people, have that responsibility, and we reward those legislators, and they're happy with the situation the way it is. That's why, as I just mentioned, that some of them have been in Washington for decades, and if you read the news or you hear comments that are made about particular senator for what he or she has been doing, it is obvious that that individual should not be in Washington, and yet he or she still is, and rest assured that individual will continue to be in Washington. How in the world that happened? Now, for a parent who decide to spoil a child, it is easier to understand, because most of the time when you hear of a spoiled child, there is a great likelihood that that child is the only child the parents have. And because of that, they want the child to always have what the child wants, no matter what. Not that from a parenting perspective, it is the best approach, but it is understandable. But in the case of the legislators in Washington, it is not at all understandable that if you entrust, because in a sense, those legislators were hired by we the people, whether from the Democrat side or the Republican side. They were hired to do a job, and at the end of their contract, we evaluate that they did not do the job properly, or at times they did not do the job at all. In fact, as I just mentioned earlier, decades after decades, we, the people, have been complaining about the fact that those we sent to Washington, those we elected to go to Washington to represent us, do not. So we are well aware that they are not doing the job. We complain about that. whether it's from the Democrat side or from the Republican side, it's the same thing. We complain about those people every single opportunity we have. So why do we keep sending them to Washington? Now, the second aspect of the problem is where I find the legislators responsible maybe for 20+% of the problem. Now, although I'm going to explain as to that part of the equation which put the responsibility on the legislators, but if you look a little bit deeper, the analysis would tell us that despite the fact that the legislators are somewhat responsible, but even as part of their responsibility, we seem to share some of the characteristic of the problem as well. So the question that I just asked, and that obviously need answer, is why do we keep sending those same people to Washington? It's almost like you hire someone to do a job, the person either didn't do the job properly, but you still keep that individual, you still continue to pay that individual. There is something wrong with that picture, right? You would agree that no matter what it is, if you an example close to home would be you have some work that needs to be done at your place. For instance, your driveway. You want your driveway to be redone, and you hire someone to do it. After the person tells you, well, it's going to take X number of days or X number of weeks, and it's going to cost you Y amount. You agree to it, you sign the contract, and of course you expect within X number of days your driveway will be done and the contract will be fulfilled. X number of days have gone by, you cannot see any progress as far as work that the individual has done. But to make matter worse, that contractor comes to you not only asking for more money because, well, it's going to cost more. Because if you keep the contractor, obviously the contractor has to have some way to make up for the time that he's spending there, although he's not doing anything, but he has to have a way to compensate himself for the time he's spending there. But the worst part is the contractor comes to you to ask for more money and more time without asking any question. You give more money and you allow more time. Now that sounds ridiculous, right? Of course it is ridiculous, because you would not, and I'm certain you may provide a couple of days to a contractor that says to you it's going to take 10 days and it takes 12. Now if the contractor comes to you and maybe a day or two after signing the contract and say, well, I may have quoted you a price that's not really accurate because it's going to cost a little bit more. Now you may also agree to give a little bit more in terms of the contract for two reasons. One, because you don't want to have to go through the process of finding another contractor, or two, you may figure out, well, maybe the contractor is not trying to rob you, but rather that it was miscalculation on his part. All that is fine, all that is acceptable. But what you would not go for is that if the contractor says it's going to take 10 days, on the 9th day the contractor comes to you and says, well, I need 10 more days. Oh, by the way, I also need the same amount that I asked earlier in the contract. I'm fairly certain not only you're not going to give 10 more days, and more likely than not, you're not going to give a single penny more to that contractor. And there is a pretty good chance you're going to give the contractor an ultimatum to finish the work or take the contractor to court. Now, those are normal process that if you hire someone to do a job, you expect that individual to do the job. But for some reason, we're not treating the legislators in Washington the same way. They promise you to do the job. They go to Washington. They do absolutely nothing. They talk all the talk that they can muster, but the job never gets done. But they come back to you a couple of years later, 4 years later, 6 years later, and you still figure out it's okay for them to be on the job. Now, there is a reason that happened. Now, this is not to put the blame completely on the legislator, because the legislators are just like the contractor analogy I just gave you. As long as the employer, in that case you, decide to give them more time and more money, they will continue to take advantage of that. So, because I am fairly certain we, the people, are not really that stupid to continue to pay a contractor who is not doing the job and continue to allow that contractor more time, and yet that's exactly what we're doing when it comes to the legislator. So the question is, why? Why are we providing more time to the legislators in Washington? The answer is because the legislators have gotten so good, contrary to the contractor who only has his wit to try to get more money and claim more time. The legislators in Washington have something great going for them. Because there are two parties, Democrats and Republican, and the legislators are very good at splitting the parties, at splitting the constituent. So as a contractor for either the Democrat Party or the Republican Party, they have mastered the art of pinning one constituent against the other, because they actually exploit the emotions of the employer, in that case we the people. So how do they do that? If we take a simple example, for instance, I'm going to use the controversial example of LGBT. Now, we know that Republicans in general are against homosexuality. Democrats do not really have a beef with anybody's lifestyle. Now, I did have a session and also wrote an article in regards to that aspect of what do we have to do with, why do we go against other people's lifestyle and the danger of doing that? I'm not debating that today. I'm not going to, but it is important to understand that individual lifestyle should not be a matter for debate. I probably will address that again at some time in the future. So the constituents, Republican constituents, are against homosexuality. Democrats is the Democrat Party is everybody's tent. So no matter what your religious inclination, your lifestyle, no matter what you feel, how you feel that you want to live your life, you're not going to get an argument on the Democrat side. Now, in order to stay in Washington, the Republican legislator who is running for office, or he is running for re-election, do not even spend much time discussing issues that matter. And the reason I say that, because as a constituent, you may be against homosexuality, but the homosexual who lives next door doesn't do anything to your life. So this is not an issue that really a legislator in Washington should cling to, because it's not going to help the country moving forward. It's not going to help the country in any way, shape, or form. But because that Republican legislator knows his or her constituents are against homosexuality, would spend most of the time lambasting, bashing his or her opponent for either accepting, approving, being for homosexuality, and this way drive put a big wall between his or her constituent and the Democrat. Now, this is a very simple example. However, it's an example that helps to understand how the country is so much divided, and at times not even possible to understand why in the world there is such a big divide between those two parties. At times, even the constituent who is against homosexuality may have family members who are homosexual, but yet that constituent would be more inclined to cast a vote for that legislator who is against homosexuality. Now, that legislator we're talking about could be seeking re-election, did not do anything for that constituent, anything for the state the constituent lives in. In fact, constituent in that state may not be able to stand that legislator. But because they are against homosexuality, for that reason and that reason alone, they go and vote for the legislator who is a good for nothing legislator, who has not achieved much for the state, but sent back to Washington for another term. Now, if you start seeing where the problem is coming from, while we may accuse the legislators of not doing their job, sometime when you go to a town hall meeting, you can hear the frustration on the voices of the people who stand to express not only their dissatisfaction with an elected official, but what's worse is the fact that that legislator is going to go back to Washington despite that kind of frustration, because they have gotten so good at exacerbating the level of emotion one has for a particular topic. Now, if we were able, if for that particular example that I just gave, if that constituent was able to separate someone's lifestyle from real issues that impact him or her and impact the whole state, the sentiment against homosexuality would not be used as the reason to re-elect that legislator. But those people have gotten so good at riling up constituent that they're able to keep their job no matter how bad of a job they're doing. Because when you go to the poll, you remember that legislator X is against homosexuality, and to you that's all that matters. And you vote for legislator X. Much unfortunately, this is most of the time what really happens, what really causes the gridlock in Washington. Now, it would have been a different story if that same individual that we're talking about were to look at the issue being debated by the other candidate, who happens to be a Democrat, who happens to either have had more success in Washington in implementing whatever he or she promised to his constituent, and decide, you know what, as far as I'm concerned, the state needs X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and the legislature, the Democrat legislator, seems to be doing a much better job. But you would never find that that's the way it works, because the constituent, the Republican constituent, would be more inclined to continue to vote for the legislator who is not doing the job for which he or she was elected, now looking for re-election, because the Republican constituent would prefer to vote for the Republican legislator no matter what. So the problem, in a sense, falls squarely on the shoulder of the Republican constituent. Well, vice versa. So I took that example, but it is the same thing for the Democrat Party. So, is there a way out of this? Of course there is. We, the people, are the cause of the problem. So, what is the solution? The answer when we return. In '96, a small network by the name of Fox News was launched with just 17 million viewers. Today, with over 100 million people watching regularly, Fox has become the greatest threat to our democracy, constantly bombarding the airwaves with false information, distortion of facts, and outright lies, presenting to its audience as news. Fox has created an army of blissful ignorance. According to a recent survey, 82% of Fox viewers are ignorant of facts and the truth. To keep millions of people in ignorance not only prevents democracy from flourishing, but it also clears the path to authoritarianism, to dictatorship. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Let me finish by saying that democracy cannot survive in an environment where truth and facts do not matter. At Fox, truth and facts do not matter. Indeed, democracy in America is in jeopardy. It is a crisis the country can no longer ignore. Hello again. So, what is the solution for this serious problem? What is the solution? Because if we continue to go down that path, it is certain that things are going to get worse and worse. So obviously, we the people are the problem. At least most of the problem are caused by we the people. We spend a great deal of time fighting one another, and we spend a great deal of time being unpatriotic and defending a political party instead of working towards issues that can benefit the country as a whole. So we, the people, are the problem. The legislators in Washington, of course, exploit our weaknesses. So they behave the same way you would expect a contractor to behave. Try to get as much as possible from the employer and give as little as possible, if anything, to the back to the employer. So how do we remedy the problem? We can remedy the problem one or two ways. I hope to see you tomorrow around the same time, during which we will discuss what do we do to regain the country back to become or to achieve a more perfect union.